This is Craig Blumenshine from Prairie Public, and today we launch a closer look with The Monitor. It's a partnership with Prairie Public and Main Street and the North Dakota Monitor, an independent source for watchdog reporting on state government, public policy, and other critical issues affecting all of us in the Peace Garden State. This podcast will be posted weekly, Friday mornings on the Monitor's website at northdakotamonitor.com and major podcast platforms. It will also be available on Main Street's broadcast and podcast every Thursday like today. And today we launch with the topic of agriculture and what's ahead for farmers. North Dakota farmers are heading into 2026 under mounting financial pressure. Crop yields have been solid, but profits remain thin. Emergency loan programs are expanding, and global forces from trade policy to fertilizer markets are reshaping agriculture in ways that are hard to control at the farm gate. Much of what we know about this comes from careful, in-depth reporting. Jeff Beach is the deputy editor at the North Dakota Monitor, and he's the author of a recent story that takes a close look at why many farmers may not be set up for success in the year ahead. You can read his full reporting and analysis at the North Dakota Monitor. Jeff joins us now to talk through what he's found and what it means to the future of farming in North Dakota. Jeff, welcome to Main Street.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Jeff, your reporting opens with a sense of prolonged stress. Might be a great way to classify it in agriculture. And when you talk with farmers and ag economists, what's the overall mood heading into the new year, into 2026?
Well, farmers are an optimistic bunch. Generally, you have to be kind of in agriculture to plant a seed and have confidence that it's going to sprout and grow and be something you can harvest. But I think a lot of farmers are also pretty realistic that they're not holding a winning hand. Maybe going into 2026, but they're trying to kind of play the long game. Stay in the game for some better cards down the road. So they're not super optimistic, but I think they want to stay in the game.
Jeff, tell me a little bit about yourself before we march on here. You have a little bit of history of farming in your own family.
Yeah, I grew up on a farm near Hillsboro, North Dakota, and my dad retired when I was fairly young, but so avoided kind of the farm crisis of the 1980s that saw a lot of farms go under and people dealing with high interest rates and low prices. So my parents kind of chose wisely as to not to reinvest in a lot of land and equipment, and instead kind of cash in at an optimum time. And I was kind of benefited from that.
Jeff, the U.S. Department of Agriculture has rolled out the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program, and North Dakota has expanded state loan programs. From your perspective, are these being seen as lifelines or signs that something deeper is wrong?
Yeah, I think, I don't know if I would call them lifelines. I might call them, Band-Aids instead of lifelines. And I think one of the issues that the farm economy is facing is that, or I've heard other economists talk about, is saying you keep putting Band-Aids on top of Band-Aids, and pretty soon you don't know what the actual wound looks like, and your policies kind of end up stacking up on top of each other. So one of the things you might argue about is is the wound self-inflicted, as far as trade policy especially, but I think what the wound actually looked like is maybe a kind of a broader discussion.
You spoke with Bank of North Dakota President Don Morgan, and I think that he told you that the loans are meant to get farmers not just into 26, but into 2027. So what was your perspective on what he was telling you about how serious the financial outlook is?
Yeah, I think it is pretty serious, or else the bank wouldn't be getting involved in the first place. And there are some federal policies changes that some people are optimistic will kick in 2026 that will help farmers going into the next crop year. But nobody's exactly sure how it's all going to shake out, of course. I think especially for the smaller operators that may, this is the time of the year that they're working with their bank, getting their operating loan for the upcoming season. and putting together a plan that they hope can be profitable. These these loans, I think, really help underpin those operators that otherwise might be struggling to find the capital that they need just to get started in the crop year.
And the scale of the state response is striking. You've kind of alluded to that. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in loan programs, from grain storage rebuilding to covering losses from 2024 and 2025. Do you have a sense, perhaps historically, how unusual this level of intervention is? And I know that you haven't really examined the full history of where we're at today, but from visiting with folks, what are they feeling about this sort of response and the hundreds of millions of dollars that are now being used to lift up farmers?
Well, I think the farmers are reluctant to use them, but they are a tool that they can use. I think that the grain storage program, especially, I think is somewhat unique in the state's history, with kind of the high winds, tornadoes, derecho, whatever you want to call it, that wiped out a lot of storage facilities especially in eastern North Dakota in 2025. That program is kind of unique, I think, and I think can really be more useful than some of the other more general loans for people who have specific needs on storage and helping them market their crop at the most optimal time.
You spoke with NDSU Extension economist Brian Parman, and you talked about concerns about emergency programs as becoming routine. What did he tell you on whether this is a warning sign or whether it's a solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think he thinks it's more of a warning sign, going back to that Band-Aid on top of Band-Aids. If you have a 1 year kind of emergency program, like the grain storage program, and that helps get farmers through a rough spot, well, that's great. If you just have to kind of keep having emergency loan programs or disaster aid or drought aid, any kind of farm payment, he sees it as a sign that there's probably a bigger problem that needs to be addressed.
A key theme that we read in your story is really the disconnect between strong yields and weak profitability. If farmers are producing well, then why aren't the numbers working? What did you learn?
Well, one thing I've heard from several people in the ag industry is that in other cycles where we've had weak commodity prices, the input costs have also kind of cycled down to or gotten lower, cheaper seed, cheaper fertilizer, cheaper fuel, all those kinds of things, the farm chemicals, herbicides, pesticides that farmers need. Those things haven't really dipped in price the same way that they have in previous cycles, and that's one thing that kind of I think is unusual about this situation, and maybe a bigger cause for concern is that that's really putting the squeeze on producers' profits, if there are profits at all. Those fuel prices have gone down, and fuel drives a lot of other costs, like producing fertilizer is a very fuel intensive process, but fertilizer prices are still fairly high, and there seems to be more competition from other countries for things like fertilizer, and that is kind of keeping those prices high, even if you might not expect them to stay high in the U.S.
During my conversation with Jeff Beach, he's the deputy editor at the North Dakota Monitor, and he's the author of a recent story that's taking a close look at why many farmers may not be set up for success in the year ahead here in North Dakota. And this is a special conversation because we're also launching a closer look with the Monitor. It's a partnership between Prairie Public and Main Street and the North Dakota Monitor. Each week, we're going to take a look at a big story that the Monitor has covered and is working on. It's kind of plays forward what we've been doing now for the last month or so and kind of making it a little bit more formal. And we look forward now to having these conversations every Thursday here on Main Street. And the broadcast will be available Friday at northdakotamonitor.com and wherever you can subscribe to your podcasts. Jeff, are there signs of optimism for farmers?
Yeah, I think there are signs of optimism. Farmers are always an optimistic bunch. Yields have been good in the last couple of years, and so farmers can be somewhat confident that their production will still be there. One bright spot in the ag economy has been the beef industry, which is mostly in western North Dakota, but they are experiencing or experienced in 2025 some record high prices and still seem to be faring fairly well. A lot of consumers are complain about beef prices at the grocery store, but demand has not really diminished. So even though the complaints are there, the sales are still there too. So it's a good time for beef producers as kind of one bright spot. There are some other things happening in North Dakota. North Dakota is trying to catch up on livestock production from, beef has been the big mainstay, but there are some signs that big dairy farms proposed in the Red River Valley and under construction that could provide more of a local market for the corn and feed products that we produce here. And there are two soybean crush plants now operating in the state that also help provide more of a local market for soybeans. Even though that once those soybeans get crushed, a lot of that product still has to get exported.
I want to talk about another theme that was central to your reporting, and that's land prices. You report that farmland is selling for $10,000 to $20,000 an acre in some cases, and those prices, Jeff, must affect both established farmers and then young producers who are trying to get started.
Yeah, I mean the high prices, the high land values are good for farmers on the balance sheet. It makes it easier for a farmer to borrow more, for operating capital if they own a lot of their land. Ag land is not subject to the same property taxes that residential property is in North Dakota. So the fact that the value of it goes up does not really hurt them tax wise. But for a younger producer that's trying to expand a little bit, or own more of their land rather than rent from a neighbor or an absentee landowner, the increase in land values has definitely made it harder for them to kind of get more of their own land on their balance sheet, and have something more to borrow against. So it does have kind of a double-edged sword, especially for the younger people.
You also looked at global forces and especially trade. We all heard about the soybean issues relative to China's decision to no longer initially at least purchase soybean products from the United States. So how much of today's soybean price pressure still traces back to the Trump administration's trade war with China?
Well, that is a big factor, and even going back to the first Trump administration and the trade war that prompted, a round of market relief payments in that during that administration. I don't think China ever quite returned to the level that they had been as a buyer before that first trade war, and they have made some commitments to buy more U.S. soybeans, but those purchases have been slow in coming. And they've a deadline has been extended. Whether those purchases actually happen, or if China is just kind of stalling for time while they can shop around, mostly in South America, for a cheaper soybean supply. So if they keep shopping, and the concern is that North Dakota and the United States is losing China as a soybean market for the long term, and not just for a year or two.
Jeff, you also spoke with North Dakota Farmers Union President Mark Watney about Brazil's rapid ag expansion. Kind of just alluded to that in our little chat about China here. How does that change the U.S. position in global markets, especially with China?
Well, Brazil has become a real competitor with the United States for ag exports, especially soybeans into China. They've invested a lot in agriculture. Some would say have not been environmentally responsible, chopping down the rainforest, things like that. But Mark Watney says that they can expand production now without even adding more farmland or cutting down more of the rainforest. Better use of fertilizer. They can afford to import more fertilizer and increase yields that way. They've just got better equipment, better infrastructure, more ability to export efficiently and compete with the United States. So they are a force. They are a force to be reckoned with.
When you look beyond 2026, Jeff, is there concern more or less about one bad year, or more or less about whether the current ag business model is sustainable? What are people telling you about that?
Kind of as I said before, one concern about China in particular is, did we lose this market for just for 1 year, or is this something that's going to be a long-term trend that we're going to struggle to sell soybeans into the Chinese market for years to come? So that's I think one real strong concern. I think the global supply and demand, it's just not in farmers' favor right now. There could be some things that help balance that out again, whether it's drought in some part of the world or another, but or increasing demand for some food products. A lot of our products that are exported become livestock feed, and as more of the developing world gains an appetite for beef and pork, uh, that could bode well for markets in the long term. But there is it is a year to year situation, as it always is with agriculture.
You've spent months reporting on this, Jeff, and as we kind of wrap things up, I want to ask you a two-part question. What's one thing that you think first policymakers and then second the public most misunderstand about what farmers here in North Dakota are dealing with right now? Let's take policymakers first.
Well, I think policymakers generally understand the problems. I just don't think there are a lot of easy solutions for them to tap into. One thing that North Dakota has, and the country in general, has embraced in the last couple of decades has been biofuels, and there are some policy changes that could increase the use of biofuels in the country and in the Midwest in general. North Dakota has also been trying to promote more animal agriculture, so that more of the corn and soybeans that we grow in the state can be fed to livestock here in North Dakota rather than having it sent to China or to Canada or to neighboring states to be used as livestock feed. Those are kind of a couple of things that could help farmers, but how much of a bump that turns into it's hard to say.
What about the public, Jeff? What have you found is maybe most misunderstood from their perspective about what farmers deal with day in and day out, year in and year out?
Well, I think, I don't know if the public understands this or not, but farmers want to be independent and do not want to rely on government programs. They want open markets. I guess one thing that maybe is misunderstood by some people is in the biofuel industry that some people will say, well, why are we just growing corn to turn into ethanol? Well, the livestock feed is still a byproduct of ethanol. You use it to make ethanol, but there's still the livestock feed byproduct that comes out of that. And farmers are buying what they call dried distillers grains from ethanol plants all the time. And when you're crushing soybeans, you can get oil for biofuel, but then there's also the meal that mostly gets used as livestock feed. So I think some people maybe don't understand how that works in the biofuels industry. But biofuels, is potentially still a long-term market driver for ag products here in North Dakota and elsewhere.
That's Jeff Beach. He's the deputy editor at the North Dakota Monitor, and his reporting about ag goes far deeper than the numbers and policies and the lived reality of farmers across the state. And you can read his great reporting, full story, and in-depth coverage at the North Dakota Monitor. And again, this will be available as part of a Closer Look with the Monitor podcast partnership now between Prairie Public and Main Street and the North Dakota Monitor. which is an independent source for watchdog reporting on state government, public policies, and critical issues affecting all of us right here in North Dakota. We look forward to the wide variety of topics, Jeff, that we'll be visiting with you and with other reporters at the North Dakota Monitor about in the weeks and months to come. Thank you so much for joining us today on Main Street.
Craig, thanks for having me. We're looking forward for this partnership to really be beneficial to readers and listeners in the state.
And we now bring in Amy Dalrymple, who is the editor-in-chief of the North Dakota Monitor, North Dakota's state newsroom outlet, and she'll be joining us periodically on A Closer Look with the Monitor to share what she and her team are working on and to highlight the stories readers should be watching for at the Monitor. Amy, it's good to talk to you again.
Thanks, Craig. Happy to be here.
Next week, Amy, will be a busy week relative to state government news. There's a meeting you're going to be watching closely, and that's legislative management. Bring us up to date on what's ahead.
Absolutely. That committee of legislative leaders will meet next Wednesday, and that's when we expect to get a better sense of what could happen in the January 21st special session. As listeners probably recall, Governor Kelly Armstrong called this special session so the legislature can allocate the $199 million the state has received in federal rural health funding.
Amy, there's quite a few draft bill requests that have been submitted ahead of the special session.
Yes, although this special session is supposed to be designed to discuss the federal rural health funding, we're aware of about 20 bill draft requests that have been submitted to Legislative Council to work on. One of those is a request that Representative Mike Nafee is working on related to providing school meals to all K through 12 students, similar to a ballot measure that circulates.
So would that then maybe prevent the need to have that ballot measure, Amy?
Potentially, there could be an advantage to putting the program in state law rather in the state constitution, which is what the ballot measure would do. That would give legislators a bit more flexibility in the future if this program would become unsustainable. But we're not sure if legislative leaders will allow that topic or other topics to be introduced. That's why we're really keeping an eye on this meeting next week, because it'll give us a sense of whether they have a hard line and limit it or if they let other topics get introduced as well.
Also next week will be a legislature's Rural Health Transformation Committee meeting that you'll be covering, and that is kind of a prelude, what you just introduced us to just a moment ago.
Yeah, the lawmakers that are on that committee, which is a very large segment of the legislature, they are going to be discussing the recent funding award from the federal government and also work on bill drafts for the special session.
Of course, you'll be able to read all of this at the North Dakota Monitor's website, but it's not just the special session that's out in front. Here, there's also public hearings on the JetX transmission line that's proposed between Jamestown and Ellendale.
Yeah, the Public Service Commission began some technical hearings, but next week there are going to be hearings where the public will have the opportunity to weigh in.
And then on Friday, the State Investment Board meets to discuss likely a controversial bonuses proposal.
Yeah, the board is considering about $1.3 million in bonuses for state investment employees, and they indicated that they would likely act on those bonuses in January. However, it could be delayed because some lawmakers have requested an attorney general's opinion.
Amy, we're pleased that you are with us, and we are pleased about this partnership, this update on A Closer Look with the Monitor. We certainly thank you for sharing what's ahead at the North Dakota Monitor. And of course, you can find new episodes and follow along every Thursday here on Main Street and every Friday at northdakotamonitor.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Amy, lots to look forward to.
Thanks, Craig. Yeah, please check out our reporting next week. It's going to be a busy one for state government news.